in the classroom to one particular number at the end of a semester or the end of a quarter and have a grade. So report cards are tricky to get right and to have the correct information on them. So we did a pilot this year with 9 schools, and we have learned a lot from that pilot, and I have learned a lot from going out to regional principals meetings and talking with principals and teachers about this new report card. So we're going to present to you today what the pilot schools have had for the past year, though we are going to make some changes to that before we roll it out to everybody in September. And Sister Alice is with me to talk about cornerstone aspects a little bit, not in great detail, but if you have cornerstone aspects of the report card. And Eileen is also here with me to talk about students who have IESPs and what that means for the report card and how we're documenting student learning. So feel free to ask questions for Eileen and Sister Alice as well as for me. So I just wanted to start with this quote from the Catholic School, which says, "The nobility of the task to which teachers are called demands that in imitation of Christ, the only teacher, they reveal the Christian message not only by word, but also by every gesture of their behavior. This is what makes the difference between a school whose education is permeated by the Christian spirit and one in which religion is only regarded as an academic subject like any other." So for us, religion is not just an academic subject like any other. It's why it's first on our report card. It's why we haven't actually reduced religion to a set of standards, because we feel like religion should incorporate and encompass everything that we do and be part of the whole life of the school and not just be like every other subject that we teach. And I also think it's important for us to remember all of the rich ways that teachers are interacting with children in the classroom. And again, it's really difficult to capture all of that into a number and a set of standards, but that's sort of the task that we're given. So the purpose today is to talk about the shifts that I think this new report card is going to require in terms of planning, teaching, and assessment. And also, so we'll spend the first sort of part talking about that, and then we will have the interlude of Dr. McNiff's call, and then after that, we will go to thinking about building level shifts. So some things that I think are useful for you as principals to think about in terms of getting your faculty ready for this kind of report card and ways that you might want to think about getting them ready now. So I'm talking to you about report card or report card changes in March so that you have some time with the rest of this school year to try out some of these things before September. And then we'll also spend a little bit of time talking about how we have to educate parents to be able to read this new report card, and the kids themselves, because students also have to understand how they're being assessed and evaluated and how it's different. So we're going to review the new report card, do instructional level shifts first, and then school level shifts, and then have time for any questions. Okay, so Sister Alice has copies for you of what the report cards look like currently. And you'll notice that there are marks on those report cards because those are some things that we're already going to change. So this year in the pilot schools, kindergarten actually had letter grades, and we are going to not continue that for next year. So we're going back to progress code for kindergarten.
That was a tough fight.
Yes. Yeah. It's more developmentally appropriate for kindergarten to have a progress code than ABCD grading. So we will go back to that for next year. The other things that you'll notice that we know for sure are changing are under effort and conduct. We moved some of the things that are under effort into conduct because they are more appropriate, like speaks at appropriate times and follows directions, are more about conduct than they are about effort. So that will change. And so that will create pretty much equal categories for effort and conduct, so then we can just have one scale of how many checks equals a particular letter grade. So the other thing that you'll notice is the pre-K 3 and pre-K 4 is a developmental checklist, and it happens twice a year, so they don't get report cards every quarter. And I have clarified this many times with Connie. So Connie has said that even UPK can do the developmental checklist because it's not a report card, it's a developmental checklist for pre-K 3 and pre-K 4. So that's a little bit, it functions a little bit differently than the rest of the report card because those teachers will go in and put a progress code for all of those skills for pre-K, not for the big sort of categories, but for every skill. So if you look up here, this shows an example of what the report card would look like when it's filled in. So this is for language arts, this sort of screenshot. So this tells us that this child got an 80% overall in ELA. And then if you look at where the check marks fall, the student is struggling with comprehending literature, responding to literature, and vocabulary and acquisition use. You'll notice that the checks signify what on this report card is called insufficient progress. And we weren't happy with the language of that, so that will also change for the new report card. So it won't say insufficient progress anymore. So we're actually gonna shift the language a little bit to make it more beneficial to the students and to the parents.
Betsy, just for clarification, is this like a first through third grade report card or a fifth through eighth grade report card?
I think this one is, I think it's early grades because of the fluency in phonics, so I think it's maybe first through third. And then anything that doesn't have any kind of mark means that a child is making fine progress in those categories. And then the NA, so in this one you'll see informational text and presenting knowledge through writing. Those were categories that the teacher did not either teach that quarter or teach with enough focus to have enough information to make a determination one way or another. So that's a little bit misleading. So it doesn't mean that at no point during this quarter did they ever read any informational text. It just means it wasn't the primary focus of instruction, and so it was not assessed formally enough times to have a determination. Yes?
I'm sorry, you've already spoken on this matter. I know that you've got some red marks on them.
Yep.
I'm looking at kindergarten, and I know you just said you're going to do letters, not numbers, but on the progress code, it says for comparison of 90 to 180 to 90 to 89. Will those be on there as well? The numbers as well?
I don't think the numbers are going to be on there because they're going to be, it's going to be the same progress code that pre-K has. So it'll be like
Right, because I see
proficient.
the proficient, developing, and
Yeah.
learning, but then I see the numbers underneath it. I didn't know for parents' sake will those be on there as well.
I have to double check with Onika. I don't think so. Okay, so this is sort of the way that a parent would read that report card and a student would read that report card. So now, rather than just having a percentage grade, we get a little bit more information about the areas in which the child is struggling based on, they're not quite the standards, they're a little bit broader than the standards, so it's more skill-based than standard-based. But it gives some more specific details. So this is a review of what the grading scales will look like. So pre-K 3 and 4 and kindergarten will get proficient, developing, emerging, or time needed as those categories. 1 through 8 will get a percentage grade, and then the insufficient progress language will change, but the check mark will indicate that a student needs more work in those areas. So that's sort of the scale. Effort and conduct in special subjects in 1 through 8 will get a letter grade, like has been the case, and there will be clear directions about how many check marks equals an A, B, C, or D in effort and conduct.
Will we be able to get copies of this PowerPoint so we can share it with our staff?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so knowing, so sort of good backwards design, right? Knowing that the report card is the end, so then we have to work our way back to how do we plan, how do we get teachers to plan using the standards explicitly so that they have the right information at the end of the quarter to be able to fill this report card out effectively. So planning, I firmly believe, is the intellectual deep work of teaching. So spending a lot of time thinking about what do I want my instruction to look like is a really useful and important task for teachers. And really time consuming, especially with Engage New York and the modules, and we've really tried to work on that this year. It's going to be really important, especially for next year, for teachers to think about what standards am I explicitly teaching in these different lessons so that I know that I'm explicitly teaching the standards, I'm explicitly assessing those standards, and I have enough information to be able to, put a grade on the report card that's going to really show the student progress. So what are my resources for that if I'm a teacher? So there are the modules at a glance documents that we've developed that teachers are using and have been using this year. The interim blueprints also identify the priority standards and give a little bit of helpful information. But I think that there's some other ways that we can think about this. So I took just 2 lessons to show you as an example. I did a math one and an ELA one. So this math example is from 4th grade math, and it's in module 3. And so they're talking about multiplication with rectangles, I believe. So yeah, area and perimeter formulas for rectangles. So they're applying what they know about multiplication to the shape of rectangles and figuring out how those formulas come about. So these are the priority standards in just that first topic, which is about the first 3 lessons of this module. And then the red ones are standards that showed up on the second interim round from the blueprints, and the bold ones are priority standards. So math is pretty straightforward, right? And it follows a very specific sequence every time in terms of the lesson. The ELA example is a little bit more complicated. So I picked a 3rd grade module. In this module, they're reading Peter Pan's. This is 3A. And so we have literature standards because they're reading literature, not informational text. And then the final performance task for this is they have to write an opinion piece where they pretend that they're Wendy and they say whether or not they would make the same choice Wendy made in the novel. So because there's a writing piece to this, there are obviously writing standards that are associated with that, and because they're writing, there's also language standards that are associated with that. So we want to make sure that they're using the correct conventions in terms of the way they're capitalizing and writing their sentences and punctuation and things like that. So PlanBookEDU is one way to track this. Do any of you use PlanBookEDU? Okay, quite a few of you do. So in PlanBookEDU, there's a way to, so here I just put, what my learning targets are, strategies, assessments. And so you could click on the standards and it would pull for you all the standards and when they were taught and in which lessons. And so that's a really easy way for teachers to track, when did I teach these standards explicitly in which lessons. The other thing that I have as a tool, and again, I'm not mandating anybody use this, but if this is helpful, is this Excel spreadsheet, and I'll show it to you. This is a screenshot, but I'm going to pull it up so I can show you how it works. I actually used this document when I was a teacher. I used it when I taught K-8, and then I actually used it when I taught college as well, because I thought it was really helpful in framing for myself how I wanted to think about it. So what I did was, when I went into Engage New York, I thought, what would I need if I was a teacher and I had to use Engage New York? And what I wanted was a place where I could see all of the objectives and assessments on one page, because they're so spread out in the modules that I get lost in, even when I just pull things for examples, I get really lost in there. So what I did was I took this Excel document, and I will send these to you if you want to show these to your teachers. So the way this works is, so this is that overview page. So all I did was cut and paste all the objectives and assessments from the modules. I didn't create them or anything. I just took them from the modules. And then I color-coded the assessments so that I knew which was classwork, which was homework, and which was, sort of a major test or project grade. So that at the end of the unit, I could look across on one page and look at what standards did I teach, what evidence do I have, what kind of evidence is it. And if you look over here on the side, this is where I have all my standards listed, and it tells me it should take about 3 weeks. It's 12 lessons. These are the assessment categories I have. These are all my standards. Then what I like about this is I can click on this LP1, and it brings me to this other page. I don't know if I can make this bigger. So this part, all of this up here, automatically gets pulled from that previous page, so I don't have to retype any of that. So it just shows up for me when I get to this page. And then I get more space, so it divides it into student learning, task or activity, and teacher activity. So what I like about that is it makes me think in both of those dimensions. So if it's more on me as the teacher, if I'm doing some direct instruction, I have what my instructions are, but then I also think about what should I see the students doing when I'm giving them that direction. If it's more student-centered, like in this example, they start by doing a carousel walk around the room. So I put pictures up around the classroom, and the kids are going to rotate from those different pictures and have conversations about what they think they're going to read about based on what the pictures say. So then I think about, like, while the kids are doing that, what should I be doing as a teacher? Right, so that I'm really carefully thinking through and planning out every aspect of this lesson as I'm thinking about it beforehand. So then it gives me all this space to be able to write out. So I just did this one lesson. And again, all I did was cut and paste from Engage. I didn't create anything new. I just put it in a different form that's more useful to me. And then you'll notice that there's a note space up here. So teachers could use that in different ways. And so how I've used that in the past is if I noticed a couple students really struggle with that lesson, I might just jot their names there at the end of that lesson, and then I know which kids to go back to tomorrow. Or it could be that this lesson really did not go well, and here's what the problem was, and I want to make a note for myself so that next time when I go back to teach this again, I know not to make that same mistake. So this can be, a lot of work in the beginning. The instructional specialist and I have talked about maybe creating these sort of overview pages for the teachers and making them available on Build Futures, so then all they would have to do is do the fuller lesson plan part of it. So that's work that we're maybe going to do this summer, is being able to create some of those template overviews. And then at least if I'm a teacher and I can see this, at least then when I go into Engage, I know what I'm looking for, rather than just kind of blindly going in and wading through all of the pages of that, at least in ELA. In math, it's a little bit more straightforward. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or thoughts about that, or before I go on, I'll send this to you when I'm done so you can see it. They could plan their entire year on one Excel document. The other thing that's nice about that is that you could turn it into a Google document, and then teachers wouldn't have to email you or print plans or anything. You could just see it in real time. Anytime they update it, you could just see, what their plans look like. So I'll show you just the other piece of this. I didn't fill this part out for today, but I have one that I did as an example that I can send you. So they can put for their whole course all the major outcomes for all the modules at the top. And then at the bottom, it gives them some space for thinking about what's the unit, how many days should it take, what's the big concept or question, what's my goal, what are my assessments, and what are my standards. And anything that I type in any of those cells automatically gets put into the next cell. So I'll show you back to that unit overview page. So if I click on this LP2, which I didn't fill out, it already pulls that information for me. So then I just have to worry about the student part and the teacher part. Is that helpful at all? Yes.
So are you saying that now they're taking like from Engage and putting, I guess I'm not quite sure. Yeah. Cutting and pasting what though? I'm not sure I'm following exactly what.
The objectives and assessments from Engage, because when you go into the modules, they have like objective and assessment, and then they have like 30 pages of notes and everything until you get to the next lesson. So I know a lot of teachers have struggled with how do I wade through all of that. Right. So the instructional specialist and I talked about maybe doing these for them to have as a guide, and then they would go in and do like their individual lesson, like write more information about those things. But rather than having to go through and look through all of that or print a 700-page document, if you had like one page where there was an overview, then it's easier to navigate.
I thought you were saying these were like their lesson plans, like when you asked about the ones who use PlanBookEDU, like was this an additional lesson plan? I need to understand because maybe I'm the only one who missed it. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's just it's an option for if they don't have a tool that they're using that they like to be able to do their lesson plans. This is one option that they can explore. Okay, and then this is the same but for math. So I'll send you both of those if you want to see them. Okay.
So to do all those linking though, you have to use the formulas for Excel. Are they pre-filled in
They're
for you,
pre-filled
so
in.
like they can just change
Yep.
it to whatever?
Yep. Okay, so whatever tool they choose to use for their lesson planning, what's important that they continue to make sure that they're doing is to have the standards that they're teaching in that particular lesson, what's their objective, what's their assessment, and what are the kids doing and what is the teacher doing. So, you know, what's the pedagogical moves on the part of the teacher and what should the students be doing in response. So, and making sure that that's all really clear in the mind of the teacher and also for the students. So having those I can statements on the board, explicitly telling the kids what they're trying to work towards today in that particular lesson is going to be really important. Okay, and then we talk about the instructional side, right? So now we have our plan and now we're executing it in the classroom. So explicitly teaching the standards is really important, and it's important that the students understand what does it mean to find a key detail, right? What does that mean? How do I do that in a particular lesson? So it's also really important in terms of thinking about whether or not kids can meet these standards to vary the instructional methods. So if I only do whole class, whole group instruction, then I only know that the students can do the standards as a whole class, as a whole group, right? If I only ever do small group instruction, I only know that they can meet the standards as part of a small group. So I need to vary my methods a little bit as a teacher so that I can have information about, you know, does this student need the support of me as the teacher every single time to be able to do the standard? Do they always need peer support, or can they do it independently? And so then you can figure out like who needs which scaffolding, like which kids automatically get it and can work independently really quickly, which kids need a little bit more group time to practice before they can do it independently, which students always need my help. So then when I'm at the end of the quarter and I'm trying to make a decision about whether or not to put a check mark, if I have a student who can meet the standard, but only if I give them a lot of really direct, intensive support as a teacher, I might still put a check mark there because they need my help in order to meet that standard. Independently, they can't do it. So like on a test or a quiz, they would never be able to meet that standard. They can only do it if I prompt them or help them in a particular way. So thinking about that and really trying to make sure that we're varying the instructional methods, there are a couple of useful ways for thinking about that. So teacher modeling is one way to do that. So you can think about it as my turn as a teacher, I'm going to model for you what this looks like. Then it's our turn as a class. We're all going to practice this as a group. Then it's your turn, either independently or in groups, to try this out. So that then I know I'm scaffolding that lesson, especially if it's the first time that I'm teaching it. And then when you turn it over to the students, then I can make some careful observational notes and see which ones are struggling, which ones need help, which ones are getting it, and then how do I adjust accordingly. Another way of thinking about that is model, coach, fade. It's sort of the same way of saying the same thing. So here's an example that we could do with inferencing. So if I'm looking at how to make inferences, I might put this sentence up on the board and say to the students, you're in a school sitting at your desk when all of a sudden you hear this ear-piercing noise and everyone gets up and walks out of class. So when I read that sentence, I'm thinking about it and I think, well, there's a little bit of some clues here that let me know what's going on. So I know I'm in school, I hear this sound, everyone's walking away. I've been in school before, I've seen that happen, I think it's a fire drill. Do you agree? And the kids will say yes. And you can have a conversation about it. And then we would go to maybe working with a partner, so now I coach. So then I give them a different sentence and I say, you hear a truck in your neighborhood that is playing sweet music on a very hot day. So then I pair them up, I walk around, I listen to their conversation, I ask them to circle the words that they think are clues, and using our inferencing skills, what do we think is happening?
Ice cream truck.
An ice cream truck, right? And then as an exit ticket, I might give them a third sentence and say, your dad stomps into the living room, turns off the TV, and frowns at you. And so I want you to find out what your key words are and give me a sentence about what you think is happening. So what do you think is happening in this? Okay, so the child is in trouble for whatever reason. So this one is a little bit more ambiguous. So they could say, you know, I was grounded and I told I couldn't watch TV and my dad caught me watching TV and that's why he's mad. Or, yeah, you know, I was supposed to be doing my homework, I wasn't, I was watching TV, right? So, but then I have an idea of what the kids got out of that. Every single child, right? So then, because sometimes, you know, if you have a class of 30, you think, oh, that lesson went really well, everybody got it. But you don't really know unless you have something from the kids individually that tells you what they got out of it. Another way of thinking about it is whole, small, whole. So I might start with whole, and this actually works really well K to 2. So a lot of K to 2 teachers have like that classroom meeting time where all the kids are, you know, maybe on the rug or with me at the center, and I, you know, do a teacher read aloud or we read a big book. And then I model a particular strategy, and then I break them into small groups. But I think what's really important that doesn't always happen is to bring them all back together again at the end and do that whole class debriefing. So when I modeled the strategy, this is what it looked like. When you went out and tried it, what was difficult? What did you struggle with? You know, what do you need more information or help about, and have that kind of debriefing with them at the end. In the new report card, you will notice that ELA is now 1 grade. So there's not a separate reading grade and a separate ELA grade. It's now 1 grade. So teachers are going to have to think about, how do I integrate grammar, spelling, vocabulary, writing with what the kids are actually reading, which is better pedagogically than keeping them separate. There's a lot of research to support that. So that isn't to say that we're no longer teaching grammar, spelling, vocabulary, writing. We're absolutely teaching those things. It's just that we're teaching them in context. So rather than having a separate vocabulary book that pulls vocabulary words and a separate grammar book that gives me a lesson on nouns, it all stems from what I'm reading. So I pull vocabulary from what kids are actually reading in literature and informational text. I pull grammar lessons out of what kids are actually reading. So I would maybe teach a 10-minute mini lesson on a grammar concept and then have them directly see how it shows up in what they're reading, right? So one way to think about this, and this is not only true for ELA, it's also true in content areas, because academic vocabulary is very, very, very important for kids to develop. And they have to develop academic vocabulary in every single subject area, even in math, when they get into word problems, and they have to be able to understand what the problem is asking them to do. So it's important for teachers to understand how to distinguish between need-to-know words and nice-to-know words. So need-to-know words would be words that students are going to be unfamiliar with, that are going to get in their way from understanding the text. They can't use context clues to figure it out. They're going to stumble when they're reading them. So those are words that you want to explicitly pull out and have teachers teach. They also want to assess words that are going to continue to appear when you know that this is a term that's going to show up over and over and over again. You want to make sure that that's something that students know. And then some of the words, depending on their difficulty level, can also be spelling words, and you can make those vocabulary words spelling words as well. And then you can create word walls of the words that will appear frequently, and do a lot of work with anchor text and being able to understand how to use that vocabulary. So here's an example. So this comes from the book Bobby the Brave Sometimes. So it says, standing up straight, Bobby said to Jillian Czar, I am not a disgrace. I am Bobby Elias Chan. And if you don't like that, then you can just go back to Mars. So I could have the students do a grammar activity with this. So I pulled it from the book we're reading. So I could say, circle all the proper nouns and underline the pronouns. And then we can have a conversation about, how do you find proper nouns? What's the difference between a proper noun and a pronoun? Then if you get vocabulary, and what do you think disgrace means? What are some words that give you some clues based on what the context is? How do you think Bobby is feeling, and what makes you think so? So then I'm getting in some writing skills and some imprinting, so they could just do a little quick write of how they think Bobby is feeling. So then with one simple example from the book that they're actually reading, I can get some grammar and some vocabulary and some writing practice in. So really making sure that students are able to understand those skills in isolation, but also in context, is really important. And there's been a lot of writing and thinking about that. So I think as Catholic schools for a long time, we are very good at teaching grammar and teaching spelling and vocabulary and those things. But I think we have to be really careful to make sure that students can put those pieces together. So do I not just know what a noun is, but can I show that in my writing, and can I show it in my reading, and can I use that kind of language to be able to talk about text? And then if you're in upper grades, you can get more complicated, like we have ellipses here. And so what does that do to the meaning of the text if I have this, this grammatical concept that I'm putting in, but it affects meaning? What does it mean that I have an exclamation mark and quotation marks, and how do I make sense of all of that as a reader? And then in thinking about writing, students need to be reading and writing every day, and when students are good readers, they're good writers, and when students are good writers, they're good readers. So those things are really well connected. So when they're writing, they should be writing about what they're reading, either for literature or informational text. So there are many examples of things that teachers can do. They can write book reviews, literary essays, character sketches, an author profile. They can build creative writing in. They can write a poem. They can write a different ending to a book that they like. They can interview a character. They can write a play. When you you get into the upper grades, they can start doing critical writing about informational text, which becomes really important. They can do self-evaluative kind of writing, like who am I as a reader? What kind of things do I like to read? What does that tell me about my identity? And then they can use a text as a springboard to explore something similar. So those are all options for writing. And then these are some writing prompts that teachers can use. There's a really strong focus right now about being able to connect what I'm writing to what I'm reading and being able to show that in evidence, right? And so that'll show up on the state test. It shows up in, you know, a lot of high school work. It'll show up in eventually when they get to college. So the author shows on this page where it says this. That's where my ideas are coming from. There's proof of my thinking on this page. This is supported by this. And then there are ways to think about, you know, a character that I see myself in is this one. If my mom read this book, my mom would relate to this character for these reasons. Okay, so those are from the teaching side and the planning side. Any questions so far about teaching or planning? Okay, so then the big part of this is the assessment piece, right? And so how are we going to know that this is what kids know and are able to do? So it's important to note the standards on the assessments, and we talked about that earlier in the year. And I know a lot of teachers have shifted that. Have you seen that shift in your teachers? Of them putting standards on assessments and using rubrics, and so that this will make the report card easier for them if they're already in that habit and that practice of doing that. And so it's also important to understand, so not necessarily to put the standards on every kind of assessment, but to have a really clear understanding for themselves as teachers. If I give an exit ticket, what is that telling me, right? So they don't necessarily have to put the standard on that exit ticket, but for themselves they have to know, what is this exit ticket telling me about what the kids know, and how am I going to use that information tomorrow in my teaching? So when I was teaching students, I used to tell them that homework and classwork and things are more practice, and they're for the kids to know sort of where they're struggling, and they're also really useful information for me to know where they're struggling. And so it's sort of like if you think about the analogy of taking your driver's test. So when you're learning how to drive, you go out with mom and dad, you sit in the car, you practice, and then you go and you take your formal driving test exam. And so the instructor isn't going to say, oh, I happen to know when you were driving with your mom the other night, you made a mistake and, you know, turned right on a red when you weren't supposed to. They just evaluate you in the real time when you're doing the driving. So, but mom and dad use all of that information to kind of help you practice and try not to stress you out too much so you don't crash the car. So homework and classwork for me is more that mom and dad helping you drive the car kind of situation, where we're trying to help kids figure out, like, it's okay to make mistakes. You're learning, you're practicing. This is what homework is for. This is what classwork is for. Then when you get to the test and the quiz, that's the time where we really see what you can do based on all that practice that you were doing. And so going back into your plans and figuring out what did I teach when is a helpful way to be able to figure out what exactly have I taught and how much evidence do I have that kids can actually do these particular standards. And I also think it's helpful to start for teachers to have that practice of taking observational notes while they're teaching. So while kids are actively working on something, to kind of go around, and not every student every time, but I might say, you know, today I'm going to pay attention to these 5 kids and take some careful notes about what they're actually doing when they're doing this group work, so that I have better information about where they're struggling or what they're doing well. So the big takeaway from all of this is that a teacher should not put a check mark on the report card based on one piece of assessment, no matter how big it is. So even if it's a big summative assessment and the student doesn't do well, that's not enough information to put a check mark. So you have to have multiple examples of how kids were struggling with a particular standard before you put a check mark. And it's also something that a teacher should not do arbitrarily. So you don't want teachers at the end of the quarter to sit in front of the computer and say, yeah, I kind of think they're struggling with that, I'm going to put a check mark. They have to be really deliberate about, why am I putting that check mark? What kind of evidence do I have? How would I explain that to a parent? How would I explain it to the child? And to be able to say with confidence that a child really is struggling with that particular aspect. So back to that Peter Pan example, just in that very first lesson where they do that carousel walk, they do two things. So the first time around, they do the pictures and they do a picture walk. The second time, they get actual excerpts from the story that they read, and then they talk about, you know, what do we think we're going to read about. So then I get two different kinds of information if I'm really paying close attention at the end of that lesson. What do kids get from pictures? So what do they get from sort of non-print text? And then what do they get from actual text? So I might find that there's a child that's really good at the picture walk part of it, but struggles with the print. So then what does that tell me that I need to do with that particular child? Or a child that struggles more with the pictures, but not with the print, and what does that tell me? So I'm getting two different kinds of formative assessments that help me know what kids are understanding out of that lesson and where I might want to be able to support them. And then in math, where they're working on the formula for area and perimeter of rectangles, the way that the math lessons are structured, there are lots of opportunities for being able to see what the kids can do. So they do lots of classwork. So they do concept development, they have a discussion with a partner, they work through some problem sets, they complete an exit ticket. And then they do a homework assignment after that. So I get all that information about what they are understanding about that lesson. So not only do they know how to use the formula, but they know how to explain it, they know how to talk about it, they have that oral language piece, so all of that is really helpful in paying attention to what they can do. So we all know that there are some students that if you give them a formula, they can find the answer absolutely, but they can't explain it. And they really have to be able to explain how they got the answer and be able to write about that, so that's important to know. So how do we track this student progress? So these sample tests that we went over a couple times ago when I was here, these are a really clear way to do that. So you know, when you have the standards right there, then you can look at where is the child struggling, so not just the overall grade, but how do we break that down, and where are we struggling, and how do I transfer that to the report card information? And then thinking about frequency of display and how much evidence you have. So if a student never or rarely shows you that they can meet the standard and you don't have any clear evidence of them being proficient in that area, then you would put a check. If they occasionally do it and you have partial evidence, then you have to sort of weigh that and think about, you know, how strong is the student? What kind of evidence do I have? Maybe they can only do it when it's classwork and homework, but when it's a test or a quiz, they can't. So then I will probably put a check because I want parents to know that this is an area that they're struggling. If they usually, frequently, or always do it and you have lots of evidence, then you can feel confident that the student is proficient in that standard. This is a tool that we gave to the pilots that we were hoping would be helpful, but I think in some cases it became a little bit overwhelming. But the idea was just to have some kind of tool for tracking how kids are doing towards these standards. And I want to change this a little bit because the way that I would like to change the report card would allow teachers to put this into Cornerstone rather than creating a separate document. But what I really want teachers to be able to do is at the end of the quarter to be able to run a report that shows what are all the information I have about this particular standard? What's all the assignments that are connected to this particular standard, so that when they go to the report card, it's easy and clear for them to figure out, you know, what are all the assignments that I have that are related to this. But what's helpful with something like this is being able to think about, you know, if I look across at a particular student, maybe they do fine in all their homework assignments, but they always struggle in class. And then that's useful for me to know, because then I can say to mom and dad, maybe you're helping a little too much with homework at home because they do great every time they do homework, but in class they really struggle. And then you could say to the parents something helpful, like maybe you should set a timer and let them do homework by themselves for 20 minutes and then check on them and see how they're doing. Or, you know, you might have to kind of teach them about what helping with homework really means, right? It doesn't mean like, let me just do it for you because it's quicker, or, you know, let me check and make sure you got every single answer right, but what's a productive way to help? So having something like this actually helps that conversation. Or maybe it's a case where they do really well in classwork and homework, but they struggle in tests and quizzes, and so maybe they have some test anxiety, and we could, you know, think about what are some things that we could do to work on that. So just having more information about not only the standards, but also how kids do on what kinds of assessments is useful information to communicate. So that's an overview of that. Another option is to have some student conferences. So that you can think about conferencing with individual students and saying, you know, let us have a meeting about your reading comprehension. Here's what I've observed about your reading comprehension. This is what I want you to work on between now and the next time we meet. And being able to pull kids, you know, while kids are working at centers or doing other things, to be able to have these kind of quick meetings with them is really helpful. Or you might say, you know, I want to pull a couple kids and have them read for me, so then I'm working on their reading fluency and I'm jotting down some of my observations, and the next time I hear them read, I want them to have, you know, made this next step. So that's another option. And then if you are working with groups, then you can track sort of what the groups are doing, so you can have what standard are they working on, what strategy have I taught them, who are the names of the kids who are in that group, and then what are some of my observations or touch points I made with them in that particular lesson, so that the next time I pull that same group, I know, you know, sort of where I want them to be between this time and the next time. So again, these are all just options of ways that teachers might think about documenting these things. None of these are things I'm mandating that they do, but just different examples of that. And so what I think would be useful is to talk about some of these things. I wouldn't talk about all of them the way I just did, because this is overwhelming to a teacher if I just did what I just did with all of you, with a faculty. But if you pick maybe one or two things and say, you know, this quarter, I really want us to really think carefully about how we're documenting student groups, the way that we're using groups in the classroom. So why don't we all try to record some information about student groups in this particular way and have them try that out. So it's not, here's all the things that I'm going to dump on you all at once and have you try out immediately, right? So you might want to pick one or two of these things that you think would be helpful for your teachers, because you all know your context and what your teachers are trying to do. If you don't ever have teachers who are using groups, then this is probably not the most useful tool to start with, right? So then you might want to start with something else. But I do think it's important to start having a conversation with your teachers about how do you know what kids are getting out of your lessons, right? So what are the ways in which you're observing students, and how are you figuring out what they know and are able to do, and how do you use that information, right? So when you teach a lesson, if you figure out that half the class didn't get it, what do you do with that information? So how does that impact what you do the next day? And so those are some good conversations to start having, so that teachers can start thinking about, how am I really documenting this? And so I don't want them to see that as like clerical work or busy work, but as like deep thinking about their teaching. So how do I know